Welcome to this presentation where we'll go through the Legacy metagame and have a look at a couple of the popular decks and how you can interact with them. For each deck, we'll have a look at which popular threats they play and which pieces of interaction they tend to play. And then we'll have a look at a couple of cards you can play in the main deck or in the sideboard to interact with those decks. Now, this discussion will be from the perspective of the decks that I usually play, but I think they will be relevant for quite many decks. I usually play a creature-based deck with any color combination is possible, but usually white, blue, black, and green. In my deck building, I will usually try to look at other decks like this to figure out which types of interaction would I like to play. So basically, if some interactive elements, cards, come up in very many matchups, that means I probably want to put those cards in my sideboard. It's also a way for me to consider some difficult matchups, just to see which types of interactions could I use to improve my matchup. If we want to try to reflect on how the metagame has changed here, I think Psychic Frog was clearly a very dominant card that defined how you needed to build your deck in terms of interaction in the previous metagame. You really needed to answer Psychic Frog early in the game. So you wanted to have removal for turn 1 and turn 2, maybe multiple removal. And you wanted to be able to play removal through a days. So if it was one CMC, that was a really big advantage. So Swords and Plowshares and Pyroblast were really good, for example. Solitude, perhaps, Fatal Push. And you also had Tamiyo, which made similar requirements on your deck. Although Tamiyo takes more time to gain card advantage. On the other hand, if Tamiyo flips, he also threatens to win the game and becomes a card advantage engine. But Tamiyo is of course still around, so some of this requirement is still available in the metagame. What type of decks replaced the place that Psychic Frog and the Frog decks had in the metagame as the leading two decks, perhaps? We see Nadu being popular, but it was also a popular deck before, all three of them. But I think maybe Eldrazi and Red Stompy have climbed up to replace the Frog decks a bit. So these are now the decks you really need to prepare for. Although they are in a way quite similar to the Turbo Forge or Turbo Ring deck, because they use Ancient Tomb and they accelerate heavily and they dump their hand on the board as quick as they can, and then they play the One Ring to replenish their threats. So in a way, there's not such a big difference, but of course the Forge deck required artifact interaction, while artifact interaction doesn't do that much against Eldrazi and Red Stompy. What I think could be relevant, as we'll see in the discussion, is playing perhaps better creatures against these decks. Like playing better creatures is not relevant against Turbo Forge decks, and it's not relevant against Frog because the Frog deck can daze and remove and also fly over most creatures. So I think that could be a potential change in the meta game. That's one way to change. Now, of course, this analysis is why we're doing this presentation. Like, we have to go through the decks one by one and consider how we can interact with them before we can conclude how we should be building our decks for this metagame. So we can't really expect to answer the question of how we need to interact with the metagame already in this screen, but that's what we'll try to see in this presentation. And I will probably not provide a reflection to summarize the observations at the end of this presentation, but rather this is our opportunity to together look at some of the current decks to beat and figure out how do we want to play against them. And to summarize all these changes is not going to be easy, right? You have to look at your deck and see which weaknesses your deck has to figure out what the final changes to your deck will be. Right? But at least these are some of the changes that we can see already on a high level in the metagame, I think. Natural Order Nadu, or the Elf-style Nadu list, it plays a lot of mana ramping creatures, Mono Dorks, and Gaia's Cradle, so that's what makes it similar to Elves. And also the Natural Orders and Green Sun Zeniths, just like Elves. It also plays Chords of Calling, so it has a lot of redundancy in the tutor segment, these slots here. And the tutors they can use to get Nadu, or to get these are their main interactive elements, I think. Olosaurus Shepherd, which stops counterspells, and Sylvan Safekeeper, which stops spot removal. If you want to interact with this deck, you discard, they can't protect against discard, and you want all the spot removal you can get for low mana, because they're really explosive with their Mono Dorks. So when they play the Safe Shepherd, you want to remove it immediately in case you have this counter spells, so you can counter their key cards. And if they get the Safekeeper into play, you really want to pressure it, so they have to sacrifice many lands until they have to sacrifice the Safekeeper. And if you don't have enough removal and fast enough removal, they're going to get Nadu into play and perhaps the combo, so they outdraw you. So you can never get too much spot removal against this deck, I think. Which is one of the reasons I really enjoyed having Bowmasters in my list, because the Bowmaster can pressure the Safekeeper, and it also has a lot of relevance in control and combo matchups. So this deck uses Nadu and Nomads, the Nadu and Nomad combo, to just draw more cards. It fits with the tutors, but they don't really win using this combo. They more likely win by getting Crater Hoof or Atraxa. So how do you interact with this deck? Well, because they have so many tutors here. Like last list I saw only had one Nature Lorder, but they probably have 9 to 10, 11 tutors. That makes Grafdigger's Cage, Containment Priest, and Gaddock Teeg extremely relevant. And also because they don't have a lot of removal. I think usually they play 4 Swords to Plowshares and not that much more removal. They probably board into some removal, but usually when you're playing a tutor-heavy deck like this, you want to tutor for your answers, your sideboard cards, right? So if you play turn 1 Grafdigger's Cage, they can't Green Unseen it for some answer to that. Like, this card is really good because decks that, I've been saying this so many times now recently, decks that ramp aggressively, they had to dedicate a lot of resources to ramping, which means that they are lighter on actual threat. They have a lower threat density, potentially. So that makes this card better. Like if they have a starting hand with like 4 or 5 mana sources and you play this card, cutting the few threats they have in hand, you're really interacting in a good way with the game plan, I think. But many of those decks are starting to play Wheel of Summer. Like in November, I saw very few Wheel of Summers, but now I saw many Nadu decks adding Wheel of Summer to them. Pyroblast is a good way to answer Nadu, but it doesn't do much else in this matchup. I mean, you can target Atraxa. So Pyroblast isn't great here, but you may want 1 or 2 copies perhaps, so you can easily counter Nadu or remove it. Because they're playing quite little removal, Meddling Mage is pretty good. A similar card to Thoughtseize, so you can play Meddling Mage and name... I mean, it's not great, like Thoughtseize is much better, but you can name Nadu or Nomads or maybe Chord. Like, I guess Chord is the only card here that actually tutors for Nomads. Maybe you want to name Chord. Sweepers are really good because they are ramping aggressively. Sweepers are good against Gaea's Cradle. The only problem is that Sweepers are a little bit slow. And there's also the question of which Sweeper you want to play. Toxic Deluge costs life. It's maybe the best Sweeper, but it can be difficult to afford paying life against Eldrazi and Delver decks. Split Up is really good, a flexible sweeper, but the problem is that if they have a lot of mana dorks, then they can just if you try to sweep untapped creatures, they can just tap them, right? So you have to sweep tapped creatures, and maybe they didn't tap their creatures that turn, so it makes it more difficult. I think Plague Engineer is really good here because you can it lets you target their Safekeeper, which can otherwise be difficult to target with to remove with spot removal. But you can also name elves. Perhaps you have more targets for that. Plague Engineer is pretty good. And as you see in my main deck, I have so much spot removal that's relevant here. I've been playing Swords to Plowshares, of course, the best removal. You can always answer their turn 1 Monodork, for example. Solitude is a costly answer, but it's relevant. You can tap out and still have answer if they try to combo out. Snap Custom Mage doubles up on Swords to Plowshares and doubles up on Thoughtseize. Thoughtseize is, of course, perfect, like I mentioned, or at least very good in getting rid of their threats. Like if they have a Natural Order, you really want to answer that before they get Atraxa or Crater Hoof. Prismatic Ending is another turn 1 removal. Bowmasters is really good, even though they don't have much card to draw. It's still nice to just have a flash removal spell in case they try to assemble Nomads plus Nadu. And Force of Will, of course. If you can answer the Shepherd, you have Live Force. So as for the Bant Nadu decks, like the version of Nadu that I have played most against, this version is really, really threat light, I think. Like the previous version, the Elves version, has Natural Order, Crater Hoof, Atraxa. But this version only has Nadu, and then maybe 1 Uro and 1 Bristly Bill, for example. And then the rest is ramp, removal. They have Swords to Plowshares, I think, Teferi. So yeah, it's pretty much a similar approach in answering this deck as in answering the Elf style deck. But the main difference is that the Grafdigger's Cage and Containment Priest and Gaddocks, they're still very good here, but they're not as good as in the Elf style matchup, Nadu Elf style matchup. I think Pyroblast is better because they have more blue targets. Like, it's nice to be able to answer Teferi. And since they really depend on getting Nadu into play here to win, blasting Nadu is really good. This card is equally good here. This deck also didn't play Wheel of Summer in November, I think, but I've seen them sometimes sideboard Wheel of Summer, which I think they should, because this card is really good against it. Since this version is so dependent on having Nadu in play, I think That makes Meddling Mage a little bit better, but Meddling Mage is still difficult to play because it's so easily answered by the opponent if they have removal in the deck. And many decks sideboard into removal, so it's always difficult to... I don't usually play Meddling Mage, but I consider it. Plague Engineer is also very good here because it lets you cleanly answer Sylvan Safekeeper. The Sweepers are good. I really enjoyed Wasteland and Harbinger because they don't ramp as much as the Elves version, so if you can waste them off a land, especially the Cavern of Souls, that helps you interact with them. They need 4 mana to play Green Sun Zenith, and if you waste them, that slows them down so you can more easily discard their threats. Harbinger of the Seas is nice because usually they have many dual lands in play, in my experience. You can also shut down the Cavern of Souls effect, so you can more efficiently counter their threats. Otherwise, the relevant main deck cards I have are the same as against the Elf style version. And then we have the Cephalid version, which is the more faster combo version. I think Pyroblast is better here because they're playing more blue cards, like you can answer Cephalid Illusionist for 1 mana. They play, I think the last version I saw played 3 Prismatic Endings, so they have more removal, because they also have Swords of Plowshares, and they have Daisies, so you need to be aware of that. Plague Engineer is better here because you get to answer Cephalid Illusionist preemptively. Yeah, Wasteland gets better because they play Ursa Saga. Graveyard interaction becomes relevant because they do the self mill to use Dread Returns to return the Thassa's Oracle to play. You could play Fairy Macabre. Grafticus Cage fits that purpose here. They don't have Green Sun Zenith, but they have the Dread Returns combo element. The Eldrazi deck is an aggressively ramping deck with many threats. Sometimes they play the One Ring, but not always. I think they sometimes play Shell of the Void, but I'm not sure if they do it always, which messes with your ability to interact with them. And I think the main threat here that when I've been playing against the deck and thinking about it, I think Sowing Mycospawn is... Sowing Mycospawn, once they cost Sowing Mycospawn with the trigger, they remove usually 2 of your lands, and that makes it an extreme uphill battle for you to try to interact with them and fight and be able to win. So I think in my deck building, I've been trying to find ways to make sure they don't cost the Sowing Mycospawn. And also, of course, whatever permanent you have, they can answer it with Devourer of Destiny unless you've prevented them from getting 7 mana or the colorless mana. So I think you want to stop the Sowing Mycospawn, and second, maybe you want to stop them from getting a lot of mana. You also need to stop the Glaring Flesh Rakers, which tend to do damage and ramp them. So I think stopping Sowing Mycospawn is perhaps the first priority here. And yes, Consign to Memory is really good there. If you cost it with a Replicate, you can counter the trigger and the spell. And now to be able to do that, you need to have 2 mana available. So that makes it so that you really want to play the 2 CMC flash creatures if you can. So my deck has had... The last version of my deck had 11 flash creatures at 2 mana, like Snapcaster Mage and Orcish Bowmasters. Also, Meddling Mage can stop Sowing Mycospawn and discard. The problem with Meddling Mage, of course, is that they play Kotzleg's Command, which lets them ramp and dig for threats and answer the Meddling Mage, right? So Meddling Mage would be much better if they didn't play Kotzleg's Command, I think. Thoughtseize is perhaps the best way, because you can play Thoughtseize in the main deck, and playing Thoughtseize to take out the Sowing Mycospawn is the cleanest and most efficient way. You can do it proactively unless they top deck it, of course. I haven't experimented much with the mana denial style of interaction. I've played Wastelands, but they tend to ramp too aggressively for it to matter. If you can play multiple Harbinger of the Seas, Magus of the Moon, or Back to Basics, those are really good. But like I saw some discussion today on Reddit, you maybe want to ramp into Back to Basics if you can, so you want to play Monodorks or Lotus Petal. Damping Sphere could be really interesting. I haven't tried it yet, but they don't have many answers for it. They have the Wastscape Battle Mage, which can exile artifacts or enchantments. But otherwise, you're in a pretty good position to slow them down significantly with the Damping Sphere, making the Soul Lands only tap for 1 mana. But Back to Basics is more powerful, perhaps, and Harbinger. And Wasteland is a card you can always play. Sweepers are good, although the Sweepers are a bit slow, but it's something you want to consider. I have liked the idea of playing Plague Engineer, because it's really good against Nadu decks, but I haven't drawn them enough when playing against Eldrazi to know how efficient they actually are. Like, you can't really kill their creatures with 1 Plague Engineer. If you play 1 Plague Engineer, it can slow them down, or it negates the plus effect from it that heralds the end. You kind of want to run multiple Plague Engineers. Spot removal is always good. It's also good. If you have extra spot removal in the sideboard, that's going to be useful. What I considered when looking at this metagame was that against Eldrazi and Red Stompy, very aggressive decks, I wonder how efficient lifelinking creatures could be. Like, they usually run you over with their creatures, and of course, if you're playing a lifelinker, they can always answer it with Devourer of Destiny. Hopefully you have a counterspell or discard to prevent that, right? But I think, considering how you can use lifelink to interact, to buy time and pressure the Eldrazi deck, could be a fruitful approach. It's something you could add to your main deck potentially. I've seen many decks sideboarding the Barrow-Goyf. Maybe that's for Eldrazi and Red Stompy, I'm not sure. I don't think there's anything else here I need to mention. Yeah, maybe. If they're playing the One Ring, it's nice to have a Bowmaster to pressure them. Like, if they start drawing absurd amounts of cards, you can both pressure their life total, which will be pressured because they're playing Ancient Tomb, or you can use it to clear their board from creatures, potentially. I guess one more comment is that if they're playing Cavern of Souls, you kind of want to have Wasteland to take out their Cavern so that you can counter their spells with, for example, Consigned to Memory. The Red Stompy list has become really popular lately, it seems. And this is a deck that I'm not quite sure how to interact with it in a good way. This is something I'll need to experiment with and consider. All of their creatures bring card advantage when they enter the battlefield, so you want to answer them on the stack, or else it's going to be difficult. Except for Broadside Bombardiers, but once it attacks, they already have the value in sacrificing something, so it also requires very quick interaction at least. Pyrogoyf seems really difficult here. Like, if you can stabilize the board, they can still shoot you out with the Pyrogoyf, which can do quite a lot of damage because Goyfs tend to grow pretty big. Fable is difficult to interact with in play because it produces 2 permanents. It also negates the clunkiness of the deck because they can loot away dead ramp cards. Of course, there's an initiative creature that they sometimes play that makes it so that you have to pressure them to gain back the initiative. And also, if you're playing a creature strategy, they can sweep easily. They're playing lots of moon effects to mess with your mana development, and the Chalice stops you from interacting. So I think the best interaction cards could be Hydroblast, and many players, I mean, sometimes players put 3 to 4 Hydroblasts in their sideboard. Could be a good way, although you need to consider that their Chalice can create a problem for you. Celestial Purge is perhaps another consideration. I'm not sure how well positioned it is, but there are, now that Psychic Frog isn't as played, I'm not sure how much black there will be, but it's a relevant card. Like the Delver decks play sometimes splash black, and Reanimator plays black threats. Dismember is pretty good as well, although you don't want to pay the 4 life. It's nice to have a colorless answer to Magus of the Moon, for 1 mana even. What else? Force of Vigor seems really good because both the Chalice and the Blood Moon are artifacts or enchantments that you need to answer, and you need to answer them quickly. So the 0 CMC of Force of Vigor, the alternate casting cost is quite relevant. Also, you can get the Fable, so they have a critical amount of targets, I think, so that you can often find 2 targets. Force of Vigor seems really good. I would consider playing 1 copy mainly for this deck. Sweepers are good, but like I mentioned, most of the threats come with a ETB value, so the sweepers are not perfect. Lifelink seems really good here because it buys you a lot of time, and if you can get a large creature down with lifelink, then that can stonewall them and win you time and let you start pressuring them. I think some cards I will consider is especially primarily Doorkeeper Thrall. If you can prevent their creatures from gaining ETB value, that would be Pyrogoyf, the Caves of Chaos Adventurer, and the Fury. Then that could really water down their deck. I guess it also stops the One Ring protection trigger. But I'm not sure it also stops your own deck's ability to play valuable creatures, of course. Absolute Law is an interesting card. All creatures gain protection from red. It lets you stonewall their creatures easily, but I'm not sure if that's good enough. It's probably not good enough. This card is probably quite good against them if you can get it out, unless they play the Chalice first. But of course, in some amount of games, you're going to be on the play, so it's going to be live quite often. And like I mentioned against the Bant Nadu deck, that if you can get the threat when they're ramping deck, then ramp does nothing. So yeah, I think it's a good time to consider playing 1 or 2 copies of Hydroblast at least. Maybe 1 Force of Vigor, maybe. I'm not sure how relevant it is against the other decks, though. Maybe some life linking, like Battle is something you want in the main deck. Metamorphosis Fanatic is something you need to build around in your main deck, because you need to have a way to get creatures reliably into your graveyard. Triumph, you kind of want to play Beanstalk up the Beanstalk with it, but maybe you can just put it in your sideboard anyway to have a quick 5/5 lifelinker there. If you have suggestions on good cards to interact with this deck, I'm very interested in hearing your suggestions, so please drop a comment. Tempo decks are still popular, like they would no longer have the blue-black frog deck being at the top of the metagame, but there's a lot of tempo around. There's the blue-black version, which plays, the versions I saw played many Goyfs, Nether Goyf and Barrow Goyf, and perhaps Kaito. Kaito is difficult to interact with. And then I've seen the blue-red version, which is more aggressive and has a reliant mana base, and then there's sometimes they're splashing green for questing druid for card advantage and the threat that grows. And when it comes to interaction pieces, they tend to play Wasteland Days and Brazen Borrower, of course. The Grixis version play Bowmasters and Thoughtseizes. Bowmasters can make it difficult. They're always a bit of a trap if you're playing a Brainstorm deck. And the red version can sideboard into Pyroblast, of course, which is good against blue decks. So what do I want to play against this deck? Well, Pyroblast is really good here to answer their Delver. Like I forgot to mention, but I think the Grixis Tempo list has been playing Delver and Dragon's Rage Channeler at least. So Pyroblast and potentially Hydroblast are relevant, like their 1 CMC answers. Extra removal is always good. Sweepers are always good. You kind of want them to have cost 3 mana so you can play them around Days more easily. Endurance is really good against the decks playing Delver and the Dragon's Rage Channeler. You can also flash it in to block kill Tamu potentially. You clear the graveyard for Murktide. It's also a really good flash blocker against Nether Goyf and Barrow Goyf. They shrink so you can hopefully block kill them. And for that reason, Leyline of the Void is a consideration. It's a bit of a desperate measure because it's a poor top deck. But against especially the Grixis Delver list, many of their threats rely on the graveyard. Like Tamu kind of needs the graveyard. Murktide Regent certainly needs the graveyard. DRC needs the graveyard. Nether Goyf and Barrow Goyf both need the graveyard. So one Leyline in the starting hand can threaten to invalidate most of their threats. Then of course they have the Brazen Borrower to potentially bounce it, so they can cantrip into an answer. I think that's most of it. Yeah, a removal heavy main deck is going to be really valuable here. I made one update to this page, and that is adding Rest in Peace, because of course it doesn't rely as heavily on having it in the starting hand. It's a better top deck than Leyline of the Void, so that seems like a pretty good card in this matchup. So if I'm playing Snap Custom Mage, I probably don't want to play Rest in Peace, but it could be worth it because it depends on which version is most popular. You can negate quite many of their threats. The blue-black Reanimator deck has dropped Psychic Frog, so it has less of a fair beatdown plan, perhaps, and it makes it also less super important for you to have spot removal early in the game against that deck, but spot removal is still quite good. I'm not sure how they will adopt, but from what I've seen, they're still not playing Dark Ritual, so it's still a fairly slow combo deck. Like, not really slow, but you have time to... Usually you have time to play a 1-mana interaction spell. Like against the old Reanimator decks that used Dark Ritual, Grafdigger's Cage could seem slow because... well, they could basically go off on turn 1 before you had a chance. So Leyline was much more better back then. But now I think Grafdigger's Cage is quite good there. But against this deck, you want graveyard interaction. Like Fair Macabre is pretty good, although they can't Daze it, they can't Fove it, but they do have the Thoughtseize main deck usually, so they can take out the Fair Macabre. So therefore, you kind of want to mix Permanent Hate, like Leyline and Grafdigger's Cage, with stack-based interaction like Fair Macabre and Endurance. Your own discard is of course really good. Since they don't go off on turn 1, you can always cast a discard spell and get either their Entomb or their Reanimation spells. Spot removal is really good as well. Yeah, I don't think there's much to add here. I'll have to keep an eye open to see how they evolve. Like, when they're cutting Psychic Frog, what are they adding? Like, maybe they're going more on the Metamorphosis Fanatic, which is more like a slow, aggressive value plan. They could go for Dark Rituals to play faster. And sometimes they do. I think especially the black-red version. If you see black-red Reanimator with Faithless Looting, they are more likely to play Dark Ritual, I guess. But I'm not quite sure. The main card advantage comes from Atraxa and Archon. Like Archon, you can Swords it and you just lose 1 card and they draw 1 card. In my experience, it used to be the case that when they get Atraxa into play, if you Swords it with a trigger on the stack, I can usually outgrind them even if they drew a couple of extra cards. But we'll see how this goes. Valgavoth has a ward trigger that forces you to sacrifice 3 non-land permanents, and then they get to cast those spells paying life for their CMC. Valgavoth can be difficult to interact with, so you may want to have a plan against that. The second place finisher in the Eternal Weekend at Prague was playing 1 copy of Void Rend, which is a white-blue-black removal instant that cannot be countered, so it effectively ignores the ward trigger. That's one way to interact with Valgavoth. A Shieldless Edict could be another one, or you try to interact with them on the stack and the graveyard and hand. I imagine they may also be playing Griselbrand. Orcish Bowmasters is really good if they have Griselbrand, and any card drawing hate you might have, like Hull Breacher and Leovold. So I've written Uppsal spells here, but I don't think I actually prepared for discussing that deck, that'll have to wait for later. But that's another deck where you actually shares a lot with this deck. Like you want to have discard in case you're on the play. You want to have Leyline because it goes around any Daze or Pact of Negation they may play. Endurance is pretty good. And maybe they can play around Endurance, I think. Firmicarbon is pretty good. I think they also can play around it. They might have Memory's Journey, I think. I'm not sure. I think they may have it. Discard counter spells, removal. Removal isn't great, of course, but sometimes you have to ramp out one of the Undercity Informers, and then you get a chance to destroy it before they can use it. Gallic Teague stops Dread Return, so that's a relevant card. So thanks for watching. If you have any feedback, I'll appreciate hearing it. This is a new type of video I'm recording. I have included this kind of content in my previous videos, although I haven't had any presentation prepared for it, and I've done it in a more unstructured approach while discussing my deck design. So most of the stuff I have in this presentation is how I was evaluating the metagame back in November. But I thought this would be a nice and interesting way to do it. Helps me structure my thoughts and find new relevant cards, and also like to spread the ideas to other people so you can more easily think about how you can build your deck to interact with popular strategies. Okay, thanks for watching.